there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. Hi, True Crime Conversations listeners, popping into your ears for a second time this week. On Thursday, we dropped a conversation with Vicky Petratus, commemorating and remembering the Lindt Café siege in Sydney in 2014. Today is the actual anniversary of that 16 hours of terror in which 2 hostages lost their lives. We wanted to drop this bonus episode of me recounting my own personal experience of that event. I was a radio newsreader at the time, and this is a crime that has stayed with me and shaped the journalist I am today. 10 years ago today, as the countdown to Christmas and the summer holidays was in full swing, a chocolate cafe in the heart of Sydney was held hostage by a man with a gun for 16 hours. The Lindt Café siege in Martin Place, Sydney in 2014 changed the face of our city, and thankfully, a lot of police and government processes and laws in its wake. What happened that day and that night isn't just etched into the memories of the hostages who survived, it also haunts their family members, particularly those of the 2 victims we lost, Tori Johnson and Katrina Dawson. In the years since, we've heard from one of the Tactical Operations Unit operatives, Ben Bassant, who was actually the man who shot the terrorist dead and who legally we've only been able to name in recent weeks. We've also heard from former sniper Mark Davidson, who holds a lot of guilt for not shooting earlier, because it's a day and a night that continues to weigh heavily on them too. No doubt it also had an effect on the dozens of other police, paramedics, negotiators, psychologists, and journalists who worked alongside and amongst the terror. I was one of those journalists. I was 23 at the time, a newsreader at 2GB, one of the biggest radio stations in the country, and one of the stations that Man Haron Monis was relying on for updates while keeping his hostages contained. I read the news every hour, on the hour, into the early hours of the morning as the siege ended in that blaze of gunfire and the deaths of both Monis and 2 of his hostages. It's been a decade since that night, and I still think about it often. In fact, I would say that it reshaped the way I report and the way I approach breaking news. I can still remember the team of producers around me fielding calls from the hostages themselves while Monis was barking orders in the background. From the start, he'd always wanted media attention. To be on the radio with the Prime Minister was one of his main requests. From the moment that first call came in until just after 2 a.m. in the morning when it finally ended, I had a police negotiator by my side as I wrote and read out the news. As the night wore on and the rest of my colleagues went home for the evening, it was just me in the newsroom. I had a reporter on the ground in Martin Place, and then next door to me I had a broadcaster and a handful of producers in the room. And the negotiator would flit between me in the newsroom and then the program studios, keeping his ear across everything we did. Every time I heard a loud bang or Monis did something threatening, I'd be on the phone straight away trying to make sure that my reporter on the scene was okay. Thankfully, we didn't have to get as close as the TV guys who were within, meters of the danger, because it's their prerogative to get the shot. That's what TV is. The police negotiator would read my scripts. He'd edit them where he saw fit. So, can you remove this? Can you add that? And we'd carefully plan out what messages we wanted to be heard within the cafe's walls. Later, I found out that we were still saying too much. We didn't know that inside the cafe earlier in the afternoon, Monis only actually knew that 3 people had escaped. The media, as survivor Louisa Hope would later tell people, were reporting on the hour every hour that 5 people had escaped. And so it was their job to calm him. The media, myself included, also reported that the cafe was surrounded by heavily armed police. And as Louisa explained, They were so thankful that Monis didn't hear that, because who would have known what would have happened if he did hear that? There were many things that shouldn't have happened during that siege. The police handling of the event is at the forefront of that, and it was at the centre of an inquest that ultimately handed down 45 recommendations for change. Media coverage was a part of that inquiry, with the coroner finding that the police needed to seek an agreement with news media outlets to help establish a way for them to rapidly and confidentially determine whether publishing specific material could compromise the response to an ongoing high-risk situation. And then the media were advised to alert senior police before they published such material. But that's easier said than done, especially when rolling news coverage of live breaking events reports in real time what they're seeing and hearing. The moment the siege ended in a shootout is one that will stay with me forever. I sat alone in the newsroom watching it live on 5 different TV screens. There was no masking the bangs of light and the yells and the screams as those final moments played out in living rooms across the world. It was some time before we learnt of Tori and Katrina's deaths and the several injured. I can't speak for individual news organisations, what learnings they took from their coverage over those 16 hours or from the coroner's recommendation, but personally, it changed the way I work. It taught me the power of omission, how it could very well be life-saving. As a young, ambitious radio journalist at the time, it taught me to stop thinking as a journalist and start thinking through the eyes of the victims, to put myself in their shoes and maintain that lens in everything I report. That's a rule I have tried to live by for the last 10 years. Is this in the public's interest to know? Will that detail or that particular story do more harm than good to those affected by it? How can I tell this story without sensationalising it or re-traumatising the victims? I feel guilty for my part in reporting on news that could very well have put hostages' lives in danger. It was a really sobering realisation for me as someone just starting out their career of how powerful the media's role can be. It taught me to question, always, even with a police negotiator by my side, even if everyone else is running with something. It's a realisation that has made me a better journalist. It's a lesson that has kept me focused on what's important, the people at the centre of the story. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with a conversation about the baby doll serial killer in the US.